Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Third Sector Podcast. I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week, we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today, we'll be looking at how to divide up different responsibilities within your charity's team, thinking specifically about project development, fundraising, and operational work. It's an issue that is particularly pertinent to small charity settings, where the same person can often be doing all three and many more roles to boot. But today we'll be focusing particularly on the fundraising side of things and why it should, in fact, be everybody's business.
And we're joined by two guests in the studio today. First is Rebecca Fell, Chief Executive of the International Care Network, a Christian charity that works to support refugees and migrants to rebuild their lives in the UK. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi.
Also with us is the fundraising specialist Atul Kumar, who works with the International Care Network, amongst other charities, on a consultancy basis. Hi, Atul.
Hi there.
So first things first, you were the one who came to me with this suggestion for a discussion about why fundraising and project development should really be everybody's business. So top line, why is that?
Despite all the noise in the sector that we sometimes hear about how trust and foundations and grants fundraising is getting harder and harder and more difficult, I think that in my experience, the number one risk to a trust and foundations and grants fundraising program is simply not sending in bids, which might sound a little bit unusual perhaps, but in my experience, what the main barrier is well-meaning staff working very hard on their bids, but then finding barriers late in the drafting process and not actually sending it in. And so the solution to that, I think, is a separation between project development and fundraising. I'm seeing it more and more often that there's a confusion between project development and fundraising. I've got a quick story to illustrate that problem. The story starts in South America, and I was working for a wildlife charity where the aim was to do a conservation project to conserve some endangered parrots in South America. And we had the bid and the budget table 99% ready, but there was just one little gap on the budget table, which was for a Land Rover. And the project manager was just very busy and unable to give us the final quote for the Land Rover. And so we couldn't send in any bids. And so the parrot conservation project never happened. Now, the reason that he couldn't send in the quote for the Land Rover was because he was very busy and didn't have the time in his written annual objectives to do the research to finalise the budget table and send us the quote for the Land Rover. So that's an example of a task that a project manager needs to do to then pass that quote to fundraising, then fundraising can go ahead and complete the fundraising process. That's an example of the separation between project development and fundraising and how that can be a problem.
So what is the solution to that then? Should those responsibilities around gathering the necessary information for the budget that the fundraiser needs be embedded into the project manager's job as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give a quick example of the way that we did this with a charity a few years ago, where we had a barrier in completing a bid. We had a warm relationship with the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. They were wanting to give us £416,000, but we couldn't get that through until we sent them the full budget table in writing. And there was a barrier with the communications team to sending us that final budget table. So what we did, because it was a big barrier, it was taking sort of 8 months for that to come through. So eventually we worked with the chief executive, the trustees, the directors, and even HR to embed project development and separately engagement with fundraising into the annual objectives of absolutely everyone in the charity. And the minute that we did that unblocked the information we needed from the comms team. We then sent in the bid to the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and then we got £416,000. So these, what might sound like a small change or might sound like a big change, depending on your perspective, is really worth serious amounts of money. And that embedding of project development and separately engagement into fundraising is a big solution.
Rebecca, it'd be really good to hear from you from a charity chief executive point of view in terms of what this looks like for your organisation. How do you kind of arrange your funding pipeline and how much time do you spend on your fundraising activities?
Absolutely. So I agree with everything that Atul has said. There's a lot of busyness as a factor here, but there are definitely some other challenges. For us at ICN, the buck stops with me. It's on my head, as it were, fundraising. But we have really tried over the last few years to spread that responsibility. So really speaking to that idea of it's everyone's business. Now, I think you have to be careful there because there's a danger of putting too much emphasis on fundraising for some of the roles where it's not necessary. But at the same time, you want to take everybody on that journey. I think fundraising can feel like a bit of a dirty word for some members of staff, but more so maybe just something that's not very understood. They know that we have to fundraise in order for the work to happen, but the actual intricacies of that and the ins and outs of that aren't very well understood. So we've tried at ICN to share that responsibility with relevant key roles. So whether that's the director of operations, whether that's key managers, one of our managers manages a department that has multiple projects, some large, some small, all of them need funding. So it makes absolute sense that I engage with her in this process, that there's that buy-in across the board, because those staff are actually on the ground at the talkface and interacting and can feed in excellent intel around what are the gaps, the needs are changing in this way. And that really important question that we all need to ask is this piece of work making impact? Should we still be doing it? And I think we need that two-way conversation there. So it's not just me driving, look, we've got to get funding for X, Y, and Z. It's everybody interacting, feeding in, and therefore creating better outcomes.
So how big is ICN overall in terms of number of staff, and how do you kind of break it down, and how do you allocate fundraising responsibilities across the charity?
Yeah, so we are a small organisation, but we have grown quite a lot in the last few years. So we're 38 staff and around 70 active volunteers, which is really fantastic and a big piece of work in itself. We have a senior leadership team structure. I work on a lot of the fundraising. I spend a good chunk of my time on that. But our director of operations, who we've only just appointed at the end of last year, which has really changed my life in so many ways, she's very much involved, and so are key managers, but also some of our coordinators. So we have a volunteer coordinator, fortunately, and it makes total sense for her to be involved. We're working with her at the moment on creating, for example, a database of high net worth individuals, and also separately a database of really networked volunteers who could give time to help us increase that database of people who have resource, whether that's financial or just practical, that can be fed into the organisation. So we are spreading it out where it makes sense to do so. And we're really trying to just share the language around fundraising and take people on that journey. So it's not this strange, kind of horrible, uncomfortable conversation going on, but it's normalised. It's in our everyday, it's part of our organisation, and it's that sense of everyone's kind of hand to the plough, like we're all part of this and we all want to drive the organisation forward.
And is this a relatively new approach in terms of spreading the load a bit on the fundraising side?
It is indeed, yeah. I think we all know that we're kind of in that pinch point in the sector. It's a squeeze. Fundraising is hard, it's competitive, it feels more difficult. So it's something that we've just been sort of acutely aware of, that we need to increase our resilience, we need to reduce risk. And so we are just trying to be a bit sensible around that. And one of those ways is by sharing the responsibility, like I said, where it makes sense to do so.
Where does the bulk of your income come from?
We are very reliant on trusts and foundations, but also our income is heavily weighted from local authority contracts. So that is something that particularly Atul and I have really been thinking about is, there's a danger to that when you're heavily reliant on one stream of income. So we are working very hard, or I particularly have been since the beginning of this year, on our fundraising strategy in terms of diversifying our income. So we really know that we need to go after high net worth individuals, corporate relationships, regular giving, just one-off donations. We really need to spread that out more so we're not reliant just on trusts and foundations and just on local government contracts, because especially with the nature of we're in the refugee space, things are changing all the time. Legislation changes all the time. So we know that we can't just sort of sit back and trust that those contracts will always be there. Things can change. And the same with trusts and foundations. As we've already said, it's so competitive. We're seeing many more no's than we used to. Fortunately, we're in a stable position and we're actually growing at ICN, but I'm acutely aware that things can change in one hot minute in this sector. So we're trying to be careful around that.
To what extent do you think you have additional challenges in terms of applying for funding because of the nature of the work that you do? Obviously, that's become quite politicised.
Absolutely.
What difference does that make?
it makes it really hard. It makes it really challenging because we can't just shout from the rooftops about what we're doing. It would be dangerous for our service users. It would be dangerous for the staff. So it is really challenging. We're having to get creative and old school in a way about how we spread the word and refining that strategy and going after the right people. So not wasting time just throwing the message out left, right and centre, but really going after the right people and being strategic and being precise, really knowing what we're doing and why, and making that message clear.
Atul, going back to thinking about who within an organisation should be responsible for fundraising, you made the case very strongly for why people in all different roles within an organisation should have some stake in that game. I wonder if you've come across any instances within the organisations that you've supported in the past where there's been a real reticence to take on those added responsibilities, and how you can win around teams when you encounter that.
I wouldn't say I've had sort of long-term reticence as such. I think there's a situation where it needs more explaining than others, perhaps, is the best way of putting it. I mean, it really needs explaining, and one way of explaining it is to separate out this distinction, which is often confused, and I would say normally confused, actually, between project development and fundraising, and specifically project development, engagement with fundraising, and fundraising. So, for example, once I kind of normally explained that actually, in going back to the Land Rover example, it shouldn't be a fundraiser who decides what type of Land Rover is needed. So then it becomes a bit more obvious. Of course, the project manager needs to have time in his diary or her diary to decide which type of Land Rover is needed. That's project development. Project development is not fundraising. Once they've got the quote for the Land Rover, then they communicate that to fundraising. And then fundraising does what fundraisers should be doing, which is researching for funders, doing a first draft of the application, identifying gaps in the budget table or the text, and going back to the project manager. So, for example, when I work with Rebecca, it's very often I come to you with a first draft of the application, and then I say, we've got all these gaps. A lot of our conversation is kind of gap analysis, isn't it? And it's often numbers as well, isn't it? And so once we kind of explain that situation, and with Rebecca and I, we've been working like that for years now, so it feels very normal, and we don't even normally talk about it really.
No.
But I just do a first draft. Rebecca, what's the number for this and that? And sometimes there's actually a lot of work that you need to do behind the scenes to get that number. We had a situation recently, didn't we, when, how many service users do you help annually? Really complex challenge that Rebecca and her team had about how to get that number. That works really well with ICN. Sometimes with other charities, it's a case of, well, if you need that number, why don't you calculate it? Well, I can't calculate it because I'm not in-house for a start, but also it's not really the fundraiser's job to make that kind of calculation about how many service users the whole organization works with. That's about the CEO working with their project managers to calculate that type of number. That's not fundraising. Fundraising gets the final result of that calculation and all that hard work, hours of work, I think it was recently, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
But that's not fundraising. So actually what happens with ICN is that you actually need a very small amount of pure fundraising capacity. And if you've got the money and the time to have extra capacity, it's much better embedded in the job descriptions of the project managers and other staff who need to then feed that information into fundraising. I've been talking about written objectives and that sort of thing. What's actually working very well at ICN is that because we've created that culture at ICN, we don't actually need to put it in writing because it's kind of well understood now. But if there was a problem at some point, then we may need to go into putting it in writing. Just having this conversation really helps to raise awareness of that distinction between project development and engagement with fundraising and fundraising. And you can go a very long way in a charity before you need a lot of dedicated resource on fundraising specifically.
And Rebecca, you don't have a dedicated fundraising resource at ICN, do you?
Correct. Yeah.
Would there be any point where you might consider it?
Yeah, Atul and I talk about this. We are really growing, but we're not quite at the point where I'd say, yeah, we need to get somebody dedicated in-house. I think it might be on the cards if we continue growing at the rate we are in the next maybe couple of years, if you agree, Atul.
I think the turnover is just under $1 million at the moment. I would say probably once the turnover gets to say 3 to 5 million, then you really need an internal person dedicated to on fundraising. But even that is probably more about internal communication, about spreading these messages, like the distinction between project development and engagement with fundraising and needing someone in-house to continue to communicate that message rather than very specifically on fundraising. I think we can we can go a certain way, but then, once you get to sort of 3 to 5 million, you probably need someone in-house.
Absolutely.
I wonder, Rebecca, in terms of the things that you've learnt over the course of this transition,
Yeah.
what are the sort of main things that have come out for you, the big sort of lessons?
One of the biggest, I'd say, is really clear upfront communication with staff, and me remembering that they are not mind readers. So just ensuring that all of these pieces in my head, or the conversations that Atul and I are having, do translate outwards towards the team where they need to. So making sure those dots are joined and people are understanding the bigger picture, because I have that bird's eye view across the funding for the whole organisation, but I need to connect those dots for individual roles and projects for people. So ensuring that my communication is really clear, the communication from SLT is really clear. But like I said earlier, taking people on that journey. So actually envisioning people around why this is important, how it impacts the service user, how it impacts you in your role. So it's not just this add-on that can feel like that's going to tip me over the edge. I'm already maxed out. I can't do impact measurement. I can't do fundraising bids. And, you can have that sense of panic. So if you integrate it in the language and in the everyday of the organisation from the start, I think you're going to get a much better buy-in and overall outcome. So I'd say a key learning is clear communication from the start. Also, just supporting staff generally, of course, is just so important. It's a sector where people can get really burnt out very quickly. But if people are well supported and they know why they are doing what they're doing, then I think that can speak volumes and you can get really positive outcomes from that.
Now, Atul, you are a fundraising specialist. I understand that your specific specialty is in trusts and foundations.
Yeah, trusts and foundations, and I would include the word grants there as well, because also my work is on lottery fundraising.
A big part of your job must be writing funding applications. I wonder if you could share with us some of your top tips when it comes to writing bids, and specifically around the writing style that you use.
Yeah, so I've got a particular view on sort of writing skills and writing styles, and even the word writing, actually. So when I talk about writing, I know that in the sector everyone talks about writing bids, but actually in my experience as a day-to-day fundraiser, the work is more about compiling bids, so taking pieces of text from other parts of the organisation and putting them together into the funding bid. So that's important, because it's important that the fundraiser doesn't create new information. So I'm not going to make up that, ICN is going to do something in the future. I need to take that from existing written text somewhere else and put it together into a funding bid. So in terms of style, I advise charities to write quite factually and in quite a straightforward way. I don't really advise this very extravagant language and trying to get too much emotion across in any one funding bid, because you don't always know who you're talking to on the other side of that funding bid. There's often going to be 10 people around the table with different personalities, and some people might be put off by very extravagant language. So what I advise is keeping it quite neutral, factual, straight down the middle. But one exception to that is project names. And I've seen an enormous difference that certain project names can make. So I'll tell a quick story about that. So back in 1997, there was a charity called the Conservation Volunteers, which was running a Wednesday afternoon conservation volunteering group. And the fundraising was going okay, but not as much as they perhaps would have liked. And they found themselves often talking to a particular doctor called Dr. William Bird, who was often referring his patients to the Wednesday afternoon conservation volunteering group in order to access the physical health benefits and the mental health benefits of conservation volunteering, because it's actually quite hard work to dig holes and plant trees and that sort of thing. So what they did together, and this was before my time working for the charity, was they came up with the term, instead of Wednesday afternoon conservation volunteering group, they started calling it Green Gym. And the minute they started calling it Green Gym, that started to raise millions and millions of pounds for that charity, because what they were doing in two words was they were alluding to the primary and secondary benefits of that work. So the primary benefit still being the environment, it's still an environmental charity, but it's also honest and true that the word gym, alluding to physical and mental health benefits, meant that they were genuinely helping people's physical and mental health. And that meant that they could access millions and millions of pounds from the Department for Health and other health funders. And that was not a flash in the pan. That wasn't a one-off. It's still going. Green Gym is raising millions and millions of pounds off the back of the secondary benefits. So what I say then is that write fairly neutrally and factually and get the numbers right and that sort of thing in the main body of the text, but do go for greatness on the project names, because that's where writing skills do matter and can make an enormous financial difference. I started working for that charity in 2008, and I was working in a culture that understood the extreme benefits of great project names. And so they said to me, Atul, we also need money for our climate change work, and we also need money for our youth engagement work. So I went home with a paper thesaurus and packaged the two areas together and called it Carbon Army. And then off the back of calling those two areas of work Carbon Army, we got £163,000 from South Austin Arcos Foundation. For the first time, we got celebrity endorsement from the likes of Charlie Dimmock and other celebrity gardeners. And we even got Ed Miliband to sign up to the Carbon Army. We also won communications awards for articulating in just 2 words the youth benefits and the climate benefits of that package of work.
Yeah.
So having a great project name really does make a difference in terms of writing.
And less can be more when it comes to words.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say don't go to the 6th word and don't use acronyms in your project names. But I mean, something that we've been doing at ICN is not necessarily having a brilliant project name, because I have to say Green Gym is a pretty high bar. It's quite hard to access primary and secondary benefits in 2 words in a project name. But what you can do is what we do at ICN is just be sensible on the project names, because I have been sent in my career, over 25 years now in the career, I've been sent quite unusual project names that are going to confuse funders, I would say. So I've been sent project names that are a paragraph long. I've been sent project names in Spanish. I've been sent project names with half a postcode and things like that. So at ICN, what we do is we don't make those sorts of mistakes. We've got straightforward, clear project names like Advice Service, English for speakers of other languages. We've got a campaign at the moment called Rebuilding Lives, which is looking for funding for the Director of Operations post, which otherwise might be quite tricky to fundraise for. But by calling it Rebuilding Lives, it's a package of essentially core funding that we're asking for, but in a clear way. Go for greatness on the project name. Don't worry so much about the body of the text, but just keep it factual and neutral, because otherwise you can get into sign-off delays. So that's the practical problem with trying to be too extravagant in your main body of your text. You can get sign-off delays because somebody in the organization might not like that unusual, extravagant wording. So that's why I always say click send. The most important thing is sending the bid. And you have to do these neutral paragraphs sometimes so that you can get through the internal machinery and you can actually get sign-off and actually send the bid.
And you mentioned that extravagant language or highly emotive language can sometimes be a turn-off when grant makers are reviewing applications. Could you give me an example of an overly extravagant piece of language?
If you're trying to sort of scare people, if you're using kind of scare tactics, or millions of people will die if you don't do this, if you don't give us funding, then, it's that kind of exaggerated language, which actually I would say, and let's be specific on what type of fundraising we're talking about here. In other types of fundraising, that might be okay. And especially if you're in a one-to-one with a high net worth individual who's really passionate about the cause, then you might want to go for this more extravagant, emotive language. But we are talking specifically here about trust foundations and grant sources. So somebody at the National Lottery Heritage Fund, for example, you're referring to climate change, it's not necessarily going to get you more ticks on the assessment process that they're going through if you start talking about people drowning and that kind of thing from climate change. They know the situation, and you're in a professional environment here. You're not in a one-to-one in a cafe with a high net worth individual where the emotion can be more appropriate.
And what are your tips in terms of charities using AI to help with funding applications and maybe names of projects?
Yeah, so I would say it goes back to the project development side of it. So you've got to be very careful with using AI, because you can't be creating targets for the charity. So it needs to be the project manager deciding how many people they're going to help, how many nature reserves they're going to improve, that kind of thing. Maybe you can prompt AI quite specifically, but really it doesn't really help, to be honest, on that side of things. That's why I talk about writing fairly neutrally and factually. Occasionally, if I've got to get something down to a word limit, because the practical reality of writing trust foundations and grants applications is that you've got to express something in 100 characters or 100 words or something like that. So sometimes I might have 500 words and AI might help me to get it down to 100 words. That kind of summary aspects can be quite useful. And yeah, absolutely. Project names. The thing about project names is that you can prompt an AI and say, suggest 10 different project names, but then you still need the human to decide which one's going to work and which one's going to be appropriate. So occasional careful use, I think, would be the summary.
And I understand that you are occasionally a proponent for not asking funders for the full value of a project. That seems slightly counterintuitive as a fundraiser looking to maximize your income potential. Why do you think sometimes it might pay off not asking funders for the full amount?
Yeah, so this is in quite specific circumstances, often with the lottery applications. So I've got an example where rather than going straight to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and asking for the full £400,000 that the project needs, we first went to a smaller funder, secured in writing a pledge of £25,000, and then we went to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and said, we need an extra £375,000 for this project. We've got £25,000 match funding secured in writing. Can you help us with the remaining funding? And they told us that that's so much stronger. So this is not necessarily coming from me, this is coming from the Heritage Fund themselves, saying you're in so much of a stronger position now because you haven't come to us empty-handed. You've come to us with £25,000. That's given us the confidence that another funder believes in your project. And they actually said to us, we are now in a position where we can't justify internally saying no to your application. As long as you write competently with sensible numbers and stats in your bid, you just write it normally and you've basically got a massive chance of being successful. So it's a case of picking and choosing when it's appropriate. And sometimes a funder will say to you, and the other thing to say, of course, is that some funders will actually specify that. So some funders will say, you can't come to us for 100% of the project. You do need to secure X amount first. So sometimes you have to, and sometimes you can choose to.
I think we've experienced, haven't we, Atul, before as well, that we've seen where a funder likes to finish it off and be the funder who completes the puzzle and makes the project possible. That's the case sometimes.
This is a very challenging time for charities seeking funding. You've already alluded to a lot of the challenges specific to managing and leading an organisation that helps refugees. But I wonder specifically in the fundraising space, is there anything that you're particularly up against at the moment, and how are you working around it, if so?
I think, like for a lot of charities at the moment, just getting that unrestricted long-term funding is really, really hard. There's a lot of short funding cycles and they come around very, very quickly. So it's very hard to plan ahead. It's difficult to strategize in this sector anyway, especially in the refugee space. But then trying to put fundraising targets against it is really, really difficult. So getting across to funders, especially, like I said, when we're very relational and preventative work, trying to show the potential impact can be really, really challenging. But especially not just trusts and foundations, but the public, for example, getting their head around why it's really important to fund a core salary, for example, is so very challenging. And I get it. I get why that's hard, because people want to fund a very specific project, mental health, well-being of refugees, or learning English so they can integrate. It makes sense that people would hook onto that. But there is such a huge need as we're growing. We've got to have the right infrastructure. And that means some of the less exciting things, like we've got to pay the bills, we've got to have the right salaried people in on the right salaries. So it's getting that message across, which is really, really challenging. And it just seems that some funders don't like to fund that kind of work.
And are you just accepting that then, or have you had any revelatory way of getting around that issue and sort of winning donors, funders round to fund those core functions that perhaps you didn't succeed in before?
Between me and Atul, we're like a dog with a bone. It's just persistence. Like, we will not stop. If there's a funder that has said no 3 times, we're still putting the next application in. We just have to one funder. So it's that persistence, but learning, refining, why didn't it hit the mark this time? And going in harder, more refined, more specific about what we're asking and why. Getting that really clear messaging across, I would say, is key.
Only way to go.
It's the only way to go. Yeah, just don't stop, keep going, and you will get a positive outcome eventually. And I think it's about getting creative as well. So we mentioned the Rebuilding Lives campaign. We're doing a Just Giving campaign at the moment. And then our local infrastructure support network, Community Action Network, have shared, we wrote a blog piece about that, about why that's important, and funding core salaries is really important. And they've shared it through their network and space. So it's just trying to get creative about how you get that messaging out, again, in a safe way that doesn't put us at risk, but you are getting it out to people.
Well, Atul, Rebecca, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Atul and Rebecca. And that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. And remember, You can always let us know what you'd like to hear more or less of on this podcast through our listener survey. You can find the link to the survey in the show notes to this and every episode. Our producer is Jude Owen.